Hey, John, welcome to the Ultimate QA podcast. Super happy to have you. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thanks, Nikolai. It's great to be here. It's really awesome to be able to share QA knowledge with someone who's been in the business a while. So thank you. So I've been in the QA field for the entirety of my career, going back to the late 80s. I tell people it's not something I chose. It sort of just happened. I started out as a pre-med major with biology and physics and never really had any computer science at all in college. I took some classes after college while I was working. So I ended up in this field sort of by accident, and it's been a fantastic ride. I've been at a lot of interesting places, and they're on my LinkedIn profile for those who want to see it. So this is just a list of all the places I've been at.
Wow.
It's been 30 odd years, 37 odd years. And if you go left to right, top to bottom, that's where I've been. And it's a lot of different industries. And what I've found to keep it sort of fresh um, is that changing industry made the job worth staying in, made QA worth staying in, because you just learn so many different things as you change industries. Most of the last probably 10 years has been somewhere, or 15 years has been financial services related in some way, payment processing in the last 7 or 8 years. But it's been a fun sort of background. I've enjoyed it immensely. I've been with small teams, large teams, dealt with a lot of offshore components in Ireland, UK, India, Romania, China, Brazil. I think that pretty much covers the international ones, but I'm probably missing some. Australia and New Zealand. So it's been pretty intensive when you try to bring a team together across those time zones. But we all speak that same language of looking for quality in the product. So it's my background.
That's beautiful, John. Love to hear that. So many companies on your resume, which is obviously gives you such a broad and amazing experience. You know what's actually very interesting that you mentioned is you coming from a pre-med background and ending up in QA engineering. I also come from a pre-med background. I studied kinesiology in college, and then I was actually working towards becoming a nurse anesthetist. And I was actually shadowing like surgeons in a hospital when I was living back in Maryland, shadowing surgeons to see what the job was like and experiencing the entire thing. And there was just like one day where I was shadowing a surgeon. He was a thoracic surgeon, so he was going in and working on hearts. And so in about met at like he's like, yeah, we met at like 6 a.m. at the hospital. I was there for about 8 hours. He did about 3 or 4 surgeries on hearts. I saw like real open hearts and stopped hearts and hearts with blood. And then he had more surgeries to do. And it was like nonstop. And after that day, I realized, and I was like, I don't think this is what I want to do. And so then I ended up taking like a coding boot camp and ended up going into the automated software testing field, which is actually what I loved from the beginning when I started college. I started with a computer science degree, but then I got up to like calculus 2, and it was nonsense that we were learning there. And I'm like, why do I need to learn this nonsense to program a computer? So then I changed to kinesiology, and then I ultimately ended up back in the engineering field at the end of the day anyway. So it's funny. I feel like a lot of people in quality assurance end up there by accident.
I tell you, I don't necessarily look for a computer science major. When I'm looking for somebody to fill a role, if they have a background in English or history or hard sciences like bio, chem, physics, where they're taught to think critically, that's what I'm looking for. Somebody who can tear apart the English language and really get down to how might that requirement be interpreted. I look for that more so than computer science. Although, from an automation point of view, it really helps to have somebody who understands how to put together, how to string together the right statements to create a good automated script.
Yeah, that's a great point. Talk to me about, I mean, you've probably managed hundreds of engineers over your career, right? And you've probably hired a bunch of them. What do you look for when hiring talent, and how do you evaluate that talent to ensure that they're good? Because ultimately what I want to do here is I want you to give us some guidance. Anyone looking for roles right now, wants to get into the field or wants to transition, like I want to hear from John what makes a good quality employee, and someone can work towards that?
So that has evolved over time, right? So right now, I typically am hiring more senior folks, but if I'm looking for somebody to join a QA team, I don't necessarily care if they have a degree. That doesn't sway the decision for me. I want somebody who's curious. I want somebody who is self-aware and willing to go down that difficult path or opposite path that most people go down. So I'm looking for some character and differences in their approach. I've had folks, I hired one woman who had no degree, but was an Apple kiosk repair person, and she got pulled into Apple during one of their major rollouts and was asked to do some testing and developed a background. And 9 years into her career, she's got a really interesting background, but no degree. And when we hired her, I really thought she was a diamond in the rough. And she progressed from level one, level two, level three very quickly, year after year, like a promotion every year, which was unheard of, and really had and was developing awesome leadership skills. Then again, you do hire some people who have the perfect resume, and when you get them on board, they're a wallflower, and they're afraid to contribute, or they're just not their personality to contribute. So I, I would say the biggest thing I look for in a resume these days is somebody who understands the value that they're providing to the organization. And they speak to the value, not to the tasks. I can get any resume from India that says, I do testing, I analyze requirements, I execute tests, like I write test plans, I write test strategies, whatever. Everybody has that. What value are you providing the organization? And then what did you do to achieve that value? Know that. You said you looked at my profile, and in the last, I'd say the last 2 or 3 roles that I've had, I really focused on, well, what did I accomplish? What was it we were trying to achieve? And how did we go about doing that? And just enough to get somebody to make the phone call and say, hey, I want to know more about how you did that. So those people are the 1%. Those people stand out. Those resumes stand out to me, and those are the ones I look for. And you can do that whether your first job was scooping ice cream at the local stand, or pushing shopping carts, or a cashier in a retail. You can produce the value add. If you can talk to that value add, that tells me something about, what you're providing to the organization. So that's kind of how I look at it these days. When I'm looking for a leader, I typically ask, there's 2 questions I ask everybody. The first question I ask is, tell me the difference between quality assurance and testing. And if somebody tells me they're the same thing, I know they have the wrong background. And the next question I ask people is, how do you manage people, and how do you prefer to be managed? Because I want to understand how they go about doing that, and what way do I need to interact with them to get the best from them in the same in a situation. So I think those questions kind of start the process, and then you want to ask more leading or open-ended questions like, tell me about a time when you had a conflict resourcing 2 projects that were both the same high priorities, or tell me about a time when you had a difficult employee situation. And those types of questions are much better when you're trying to hire a leader in the org.
Yeah, wow. All so many really great points. I love the point about being value driven, because I myself have learned that lesson through my career, in terms of, it's not the tasks that you perform, but what is the value that you're ultimately providing to the organization. And now, being a leader of my own organization, I learned the importance of that, because when we're hiring people to help us in the organization has some kind of business goals that it wants to achieve. And the question is, how are the employees contributing to help us achieve those business goals? It's not about how many tasks you do, because those tasks, you may be amazing at executing tasks, but those tasks may be contributing absolutely nothing to the goals of the organization. And so then, even though you may seem like you're busy, you're not actually valuable to the organization.
I had a leader come to me 6 months ago and tell me that what the QA team was doing was not the most valued tasks that they needed them to do. Like, they weren't getting any value out of what was being produced. And at this time, that team was not part of my remit in the organization. And I said, well, they report to you. Have you told them that? Like, have you given them feedback on what you do need from them and measured them on producing that thing? Don't continue to take the same thing that's not working for you and, and allow it to repeat. You don't need a great manager that I worked with at a former company said, I don't need 3 months of data when 1 month tells me that it's not working. I can make a change and tack and go in a different direction. If I don't know, that's fine. I can wait. But if I know, why do I need another month's worth of data?
Yeah, yeah, very, very good point. And so, okay, so we're looking for value-driven individuals. We're looking for, you mentioned individuals with a unique background, like the Apple support person. How did you figure out that this Apple support person was a diamond in the rough? Like, what qualities did you see in him or her that told you that?
There's a certain maturity on that conversation. And it was more conversational, the interview. It wasn't like pulling teeth, and it wasn't my favorite word. It wasn't verbal diarrhea. The person knows to begin and end the answer to the question, but there was a maturity about the way she approached it. I had another one that I hired at that same company a couple of years later who was a 9-year veteran in the military and was coming in for an intern position. And I'm like, wow, way beyond that capability. And we immediately moved to hire her. She progressed to the next level and progressed to the next level the next year. And it was at that point that I changed jobs, and I will track her forever because there's a certain go-getter attitude in folks that I'm looking for. And it's also how they interact with their peers. How do they collaborate? How do they bring other people into the conversation rather than trying to be the end all, the be all themselves?
Yeah, that makes total sense. From so those kind of qualities you can see when they're actually on the team interacting. Is there a way we can determine those kind of qualities before we actually hire the person? Because like one thing that I've encountered is, you've already kind of alluded to this, is sometimes a resume can be great, sometimes even the interviews can go great, and then you drop a person into a role, and then a week or two into it you realize that this person is not the right person for the role. And so I'm always thinking, like, how do we prevent that kind of a situation? How can we ensure that they're more closely aligned with what we're looking for before we even bring them onto the team and onboard them and make the introductions and so on?
Listening real carefully to their references is also important. What they don't say is as important as what they do say, and who they choose as a reference as well
Mm,
is probably important. I would say that yes, you have to have a probationary period. It's important. We hired 120 people in 2023 in 5 months, and of course, we made some mistakes. Out of 120 people, if we had to replace 5 of them, that's not a bad average. That's a pretty good batting average. I'll take it. But you make mistakes through no fault of their own. They're probably just not the right fit for the organization. So I think having a really good onboarding plan, 30, 60, 90-day plan for that person will let you know. But before they come in the door, you have to sense with that conversation who you're getting. And, without getting personal about them as an individual, the last question I ask somebody is, tell me something about you and your abilities that you don't put on a resume, that you can't write on a resume. Tell me something about you that will help me understand you as a person. And that one, I think, really gives me some key insights into them.
yeah, that's a great question. Do you go beyond just having like a conversation with numerous people? Because I know a lot of organizations now will do some kind of technical tests, maybe some kind of personality tests, some kind of intelligence tests. What does your hiring process look like today?
So in general, at places that I have worked at, we have done tests where if we're asking somebody to be an automation expert, we might give them a test, and not to determine if they get the right answer, but to understand how they think and tear apart a problem. I'm sure you've heard the stories of Google interviews where they ask a candidate to estimate the number of windows that are in, the buildings in New York City, right? Well, how are they going about tearing apart that problem is really what you're looking for. So we have done tests in the past when it was specifically related to automating. We want to make sure they have the skills to do the automation. Do I require um, personality tests or anything like that? No, I haven't. I haven't. I've never been in that situation where I've wanted to do that. I could imagine why you do that when you're hiring somebody to run, a multinational corporation making billions of dollars. You want to make sure you've got the right personality fit. That comes in at a different level. I have been asked to take those tests at certain places. Perfectly willing to do that. They should know what they're getting. I'm okay with that, but I don't think that's necessary at that lower level yet.
Okay, great point. John, you have some interesting value driven metrics in your LinkedIn profile, which coming back to the value piece, like for
Sure.
example, you raised automation coverage from 30 to 90% at one of your organizations.
Sure.
Can you talk to us about how you did that? What was that process like? And what did you do in order to make that happen?
Well, first of all, I'm a manager, so I lead. I didn't do it, right? I had a
Mm,
great staff. So I think
love that.
anytime you take on anytime you're looking to improve metrics in an organization and you identify a specific set of tasks that are going to do that, you have to have the right people. And I had a fantastic staff. And to this day, I believe that that's the most important thing, is to have the right staff. So I set the direction. And in that particular organization, we were looking to double revenue. We were looking to double output in a 2-year period. We had some pretty aggressive objectives. And in order for us to be that agile organization we wanted to be, we needed more automation. So the first thing is to determine, well, what does that mean, automate? Right. And I defined it as regression automation. So pretty much not in sprint. A lot of that was post sprint automation, and it was regression use case, business use case kind of paths. So we determined where we were in the various platforms and said, look, the target for year one was going to be 50%. In addition to 50%, we needed to know what we didn't have. So how many test cases do we have? How much of that was automated? And what did we estimate was the gap to more full functional coverage, not code coverage, but functional coverage of these use cases? So you get out of the first year with, on average, we're at about 50% of our regression automation is complete. And we know what the roadmap is for next year to get to our target, which was 75%. My target for my boss was 75%. We achieved 80%. And I later found out that his actual target was 70%. So we blew it out of the water, and it was great.
Congrats.
And we decide, well, what's the real plan here? It's never 100%. So there were some teams that were 100% automated down to the sprint team level. So their component and service testing was automated. The end-to-end paths that use that platform were automated. And then there were some teams that had some legacy platforms where that was just not possible and would not give us the efficiency that we were looking for. So we varied between 75 and 90% in those particular groups. And it was typically those newer technology platforms that were the more heavily automated, and I don't want to say easier, but easier to maintain as well. We focused during this time period on having one automation framework. Now we had 6 or 7. We had various Java and Selenium frameworks. We were using a robot framework with Python in one group. We were using C# and Selenium. Several of our teams were using behavior-driven development and had either SpecFlow or Cucumber. So we had a variety, and I had a person who identified and named our automation manager, and I said, look, we want a framework that encompasses all of this. I don't want anybody to have to rewrite their automation, but I want one framework. I want it to be language agnostic, and I want it to allow us to share across these platforms. And we actually went with Robot framework for that. And we were starting to implement that. I think we were about a year into the process of implementing that. Most teams had been trained. Most teams were up and running at the point at which I left that group. So I don't know that I would do that again. I would want it made sense in that organization. I don't know if it makes sense in a much larger organization, but what it allowed us to do is to think similarly about the metrics and how we're capturing and defining success. So it was It was a fantastic path, and I had some really super automation folks on that team.
Okay, I have so many questions. First question is, in that journey to automating more regression, did you find that exercise to be valuable for the organization ultimately? Like, did it contribute the value that you thought it would?
So it did amazingly because it's sped up. So here, once we start automating, you take a platform that, from a manual testing point of view, you used to take a month to test something, and now you're doing it in 2 or 3 days. You used to do it on one browser on one environment, and now we're doing it on Opera and Chrome and Edge browser. We're doing it on 3 different environments, and we're doing it in 3 days. It allowed us to find more issues because at that time people were still not yet at HTML5. So there were some challenges with browser compatibility. And this was probably the 2020 timeframe, 2019, 2020. um, it incredibly gave us much more coverage of the software, much more use case and coverage, and allowed us the time to do more exploratory testing, which is, I think, really where you find your issues. Your automation is just going to tell you, hey, we haven't broken those prior paths. We've automated the newer ones that we could, but now we have people who are experts in how the system works, and they can go in and do some fat fingering and figure out what happens. And that's the real huge value add, is to be able to get to those edge cases so that you're not finding those in production and your customers don't have to point them out to you. And then we don't have to give the customer a workaround until we can get that fixed. So that it's you see that in the customer satisfaction scores. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think it added tremendous value.
Cool, cool. Okay, great to hear that. Another thing that you mentioned, I'd love to have discussion on, because in my experience, having formerly worked as a solutions architect at Sauce Labs, I was lucky enough that I basically got to work with hundreds of customers across the globe, helping them to implement automation strategy. Ultimately, of course, it was to support Sauce Labs. But in order to support Sauce Labs, I had to enable teams to do testing better and more efficiently, and testing that actually made sense. And so what I found working with all these different teams is that creating a single place where a framework is developed and supported seemed to be really challenging. Why? Because a lot of times it would be like a center of excellence. The organization wouldn't give enough resources to the center of excellence, and there might be, let's say, 10 people that needed to support 100 or more other engineers that were using all of this tooling. And all of these people had so many different requests. And as you mentioned, already working on different technologies. Some are more legacy, some are more recent, some are API based only, others are UI based only, others interact with a number of systems. And so like they had all of these requirements. And I found that these center of excellences couldn't keep up with the demands of these organizations. And so then what would happen is, because they couldn't keep up, the teams that were using the frameworks would get frustrated. They would start creating their own workarounds to bypass the system that was supposed to standardize everything. And then ultimately it would just become a mess. And I don't know where I stand on this. The idea seems to make sense. But I think where the critical importance is you have to have enough resources, and the resources have to be the best and very focused on delivering the best experience to all the teams, because ultimately it becomes a very challenging engineering effort at the end of the day.
So I agree with you. It's when we decided to centralize all of that framework, it was because there were several different framework teams, and I couldn't justify having people whose job was to maintain the framework. So I could justify one team, but not 4 or 5 teams. But I see your point. At some point, they're not able to keep up, and people will create their own little thing over here, their own little thing over there. So there's positives and negatives to that. I believe on some regular basis, every 3 to 5 years, you should be tossing out your tools and replacing your frameworks and evolving your coding strategies. So you end of life some of this stuff, which becomes the next, becomes your way of getting past that and saying, hey, we're going to start over, right? And we're going to start over with this one. And maybe that becomes the target for other teams to implement that framework or that style. And you come together and come apart and come together every 3 to 5 years like that. It's not unheard of. Trying the maintenance to stay within the same framework forever, I think creates technical debt that you get stuck with. I have a couple of frameworks now where that we're looking at and saying, hey, let's evolve that. And the team's like really excited about it. Like, yeah, we would love to do that. And, we'll put plans in place to do it. It solves the problem now, but will it be our tool or our process of choice 5 years from now? And I think everybody agrees, hey, we could evolve that. So I do get it. There are advantages to eliminating multiple framework teams, but eventually you take on new functionalities or build new components that don't fit into that anymore, or it's not efficient to use this bloated framework for this little thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah, it's a very interesting challenge. The other situation that I saw is within like organizations that had a bunch of engineering teams. And let's say we have one engineering team that's like supporting a web application and another one that's supporting some kind of backend API service. In those kind of instances, I felt like the teams using and maintaining their own tooling to test their own software made the most sense, because it's like the Toyota car delivery model where the people on the front lines understand the problem the best and they should be the ones solving it versus passing it up the chain of command that doesn't really fully understand the challenges that they're facing. And so to me, it was like, just let them solve their challenges and make sure that the people are good and enabled enough to solve their own challenges, and then they will do it better than anyone else. But then, of course, there is the duplicate work that then ends up being created across multiple teams. So that you're circle back.
How many times do I need to create an automation for a login?
Yes, I
And
know.
the other thing that happens is your leadership is looking at this and saying, you're creating different frameworks which tie people to that framework. The resources you've now hired are no longer fungible because
Mm,
to bring them up to speed elsewhere means they're learning something brand new. The cost to change them from this group to that group
mm,
is high,
mm.
and we're not as nimble as we'd like to be. So how do you prevent that? So I had a leader I worked with who said, look, I'm not going to force them to code in any particular language, but they better be able to code in any language. So
Mm.
if I'm hiring a senior or principal engineer, whether we're doing something in Java or Golang or C Sharp, they should be able to adapt. And if they can't, then they're not the engineer we think they are, right? So can we have that with an automation framework as well? Possibly, but I think that when you get to that level of capability within your automators, they're probably looking for that next challenge that says maybe I want to become an SDET and I want to start working on deliverable code as well as automation, or maybe I want to become a developer and they're evolving out of automation test. There'll always be those people who just love what they do and want to continue doing that, but I think you're not always getting the level 3 or level 4 engineer in your automation team. You're typically getting a more junior person. And be careful. I want to be careful when I say junior. As somebody who's been doing this for 35 plus years, junior to me is 8 years of experience is still somebody who's somewhat junior. So I think it is a interesting challenge you bring up as to how to adapt that, because you want that team that's really good to be able to be nimble and move fast, but then how do you grow that? Like, how do you look at that person who's been on a team for 3 years and say, what's your next position? Where are you going next? If you've maxed out in where you can go, like, I don't need 4 senior engineers on this project. You need to be able to move somewhere else, which means you need to have the skills to be on a different team or language or framework or process or what have you, and they have to be able to adapt.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I didn't think about it from that perspective. I guess maybe to me, what if you take a step back and ask, like, in that kind of a situation where we're deciding whether to centralize tooling, what is the business challenge that we're trying to solve in that case?
It's typically twofold. With this one, what I would say is when I go to standardized tools, I want to have a tool that is a buy, a hold, and a sell. So let's take an API test tool. I want a tool that we're investing in, that we want all teams using. I want a tool that's fit for purpose, that's working, but we're not really trying to expand its use. And I want a tool that we're end of lifing, right? And that means that we could always be looking at new tools, but you're looking to plug it into that matrix. When you're trying to standardize on a set of tools, you want to take advantage of licensing. So in a group like my last company where we had 400 QA people, having 5 different API tools or 5 different test case management tools, or it is financially inefficient because you're not able to get the best bargain you can from the vendor you're working with. Now, at the same time, you do want a couple because you want to be able to play one off the other because tools are always leapfrogging one another, right? The 800-pound gorilla in the market for a particular tool changes every 3 years, 4 years. And you want to be able to adapt when that happens. So having a couple of tools is great, but so I don't ever recommend going to just one because then you're stuck. Now we do that in most companies. Most companies we do that with our software development lifecycle tool. Whether it's Rally or Jira or some other tool that's providing you that, it's hard to switch between those tools. So you tend to standardize on them. But when you're talking about more contained tools, I think it's better to have a few options and not a lot. And it's usually for financial reasons. And it also allows you to have a community of practice around the use of that tool and share best practices with one another.
John, what challenges are you facing today in your career and running your engineering teams, especially with the landscape of artificial intelligence? And you were talking about tooling changing so often. I think now with AI, everything is changing even more rapidly than ever before. Yeah, what are your new challenges that you're facing today?
So I wouldn't say I have career challenges. Personally, I am where I am, and I'll progress to the end of my career in the next 10 years or so. I do like what I do, and I've come into the last 5 companies with the same objective: people, process, tools, technology, communication. How are we doing that? How are we achieving the efficiencies the organization needs? I would say each organization I've done that faster, right? Achieved success faster, having relied on what I did in the past. And also, again, great leaders within my organization supporting me in doing that. I will say that AI presents both opportunity and challenge. Immense opportunity to speed up the analysis of requirements, to generate test cases, both manual and automated, to analyze existing systems and identify gaps in the test cases that we have. There's lots of opportunity there. I think the challenge is that, wow, testing in AI is a multi-dimensional problem, and understanding whether what it's producing is right or not is a very iterative process. So it's not a flawless thing that it does it fast. Doing it fast is great, but the fact that it's not right or can't take into account the human element or morality or ethics, that's a challenge. So and I think that's a great place for the human element to balance the AI. Artificial intelligence is not new, right? But everybody who calls something artificial intelligence isn't using artificial intelligence. A really good rules engine is not artificial intelligence. It's, does it adapt to the data as it sees it? Does it say, hey, I've always given you this answer, but because we've hit this tipping point, I should now give you this answer? That's really interesting to test, right? So I think that's where really I'll say you're looking for a brainiac who can really wrap their head around that level of complexity. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a computer science major. It means that you have to be able to think very critically about this and how it might go off the rails and how to give it guidance to stay back on track. So it's a really exciting time for both, from a testing point of view, from a analysis point of view up front, from a QA point of view, but also from a development point of view, because you can now develop whole sections of code that may, or depending upon whose language models you're using, might be sketchy to do that, or it might be really powerful and fast to do that. Just depends upon the application that you're applying this to.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And so if I got some of that correctly, basically your challenges are the same as always in terms of, you mentioned like people, process, tooling, communication. How are you improving that? And now you're just basically figuring out how to do it faster and faster because you have the experience. So then, like, what are your goals now? What kind of what goals are you setting for your organization that you want them to strive towards?
So I would tell you, in the last 8 years, my goals for my org haven't changed in the last two companies.
Mm.
60% of what we measure people on is supporting the team that they're on. Your job is to deliver QA services to that team, period. And what you do and how you do it are as important as one another. So we want to develop your interaction skills because you are part of a team and it's supposed to be a collaborative environment. That what you do and how you do it matters. Another 20% of their goal is automation. Whether you're manual or automated tester, you have an automation goal. And for the manual person, it's you define what test cases to automate, what data to use, what environment to do it in, and what success means. And then there's an automation engineer who can figure out how to build that. So everybody has skin in the game with respect to automation. 10% more of their goal is some professional development. I don't want people stagnant, and I don't want them having their career happen to them, which is what I did. It just happened to me. I have been fortunate. That's not something you can bank on. So you need to get more, you need to read more, you need to take more classes, seminars, webinars, whatever tool your company uses for online learning. And so I give them a goal to go do that. And then another 10% goal is innovation. But how do you innovate? How do you legislate innovation? What I ask people to do is I say, what I want you to do is give us ideas of things to change or to continue or to grow or to stop doing, right? So everything is about micro changes. What are those little things that get in your way? I had a boss who said, your job is to remove the stupid stuff that gets in the way of your team being efficient and doing their job. So there are a lot of processes that we put in place that came about because somebody made a mistake. Somebody did something. We don't want that to happen anymore. So we put a roadblock in their way. Well, that person's no longer there. That problem no longer exists, but we still keep that roadblock. How many of those things can we get rid of? And if we get rid of one or two of those a week, does that molehill amount to a mountain at the end of the year? So I've asked people to generate those ideas. And if they implement them, I'll give them even more credit. And if they help implement those in other teams, they get even more credit. So those are the four goals that my teams have had forever. Now, making the deliver QA services goal real is up to the implementation manager and say, hey, what does that mean for our particular Scrum team or our Agile team? What does that mean for our end-to-end testers? That's up to them to work with the team to determine that. So that's how I look at goals.
Amazing and beautiful. I've never heard it laid out like simply as that. It's really nice. How do you measure that someone is meeting these goals?
So you have to do stakeholder feedback. I believe that you, as a manager, you should be meeting with your direct reports regularly. I'm not going to require it to be every week, but it should be at least every 2 weeks. And at least one of those meetings every 2 to 3, 4 weeks should be, how you doing? How do you think you're doing? And get some feedback from them. Understand what their challenges are. Help to remove those roadblocks. You should be reaching out to their stakeholders, the people who actually work with them directly, and say, the agile practice leaders, the development leaders, the other QA folks, like, how is this person doing? How are things going? What can we do, as my board over here says, more, better, or different? So I think that's really important to get that stakeholder feedback and to have those regular conversations. So at the end of the year, there is no surprise, right? You've had those conversations. Whatever rating system your company is, there's usually 3, 4, or 5 different rating categories you put people in. Nobody should be surprised at what their performance is.
So for you then, as the leader of all of this, what kind of KPIs or business metrics are you targeting to provide value to the organization?
Sure. Like there's a number that I've used over the last 20 years. Everybody looks at defect containment rate. How are you preventing issues from getting into production and impacting your customers? So that's a real one that you have to look at. I also measure folks on achieving their automation goals and kind of maintaining it. look, there's, if we say, hey, the target is 65% for your organization. Well, if they're bouncing between 60 and 70% and they're staying in that range and they're managing their debt, their technical debt, hey, they're doing really well, right? If they're growing and saying, hey, we're constantly achieving 65, we're pushing 70, and we think that's kind of the maximum. Hey, that's great. You're overachieving, right? There would be some other metrics we would look at, and that's some of the agile metrics around how is that team performing? What is the flow like through that group, and what is their how often are they hitting their targets when they based upon their estimates? If their estimates say, hey, we're going to do 10 stories this sprint, and are they consistently hitting it with the quality output? Not a lot of rework on those. When an issue is found, how quickly do they fix an issue, right? So there's some agile metrics that we also use. And there's another one that I used at a company a couple years back called first time right to production, which is something that I kind of like in certain scenarios where you can measure the number of work units you're putting into production. We can call them stories, we can call them JIRA ticket items, we can call them whatever you want. Measuring the number that go into production that don't get an issue tagged against them during a warranty period. And let's call the warranty period 30 days or 28 days, whatever the 4-week period is. So achieving that first time right to production means that you specified it, you designed it, you built it, it went in production, it delivers the solution, and there's no problems against it for 30 days. I think you're nailing it then, right? And if you're doing a lot of these stories, you start to develop a really good cadence of getting those in there. And when there is an issue, it points to, well, okay, who worked on that story? What did they do? What didn't they do? What information did they lack? How do we prevent that from happening in the future? You do a really deep root cause on it. You say, okay, we know what to do different now, right? And we can evolve and get better. So sometimes that metric is important. That particular group that I was using that metric with had a really poor delivery to production. I think we were something like 83% of the time we were successful. Well, geez, if I had a car that worked 83% of the time, I'd be pretty upset. 16 months, I think that improved to 0.5% of the time, and the target was 98.5. So we weren't done, but it had really moved the bar focusing on that.
Wow. Yeah. Amazing. How did you measure um, first time right to production? What you're tracking? How do you
Hundreds,
know?
let's say that
Uh,
you have 100 stories going into production,
yeah.
and in that 30-day period post production, 3 of them had a problem. Well, you're 97%.
Any problem?
So a failure of the requirements, right? So we also had a user acceptance process in that team. So the actual business users would come in. So if the user accepted it, then it met their needs, right? So a requirement problem was unlikely. It would have to be a processing problem, some sort of, hey, we didn't anticipate that in the downstream. This particular thing caused a problem. It was this story. That's typically how we determine that it was a defect. So a defect that related to infrastructure or a defect related to the deployment, CI/CD, kind of pipeline code wouldn't kind of fit into that, but it would anything that was software delivered to the customer to solve a business problem would count.
Wow. Yeah, that makes total sense. John, what kind of testing are your teams doing today?
What do you mean?
In terms of like, are your teams doing all types of testing from like unit integration, API,
So
UI,
I prefer
security, accessibility?
Yeah, I just had this conversation with one of my really fantastic leader. We don't want to be unit test jockeys for development. That's not our goal. We don't do that. Component to component testing, service to service testing, end to end testing, cross platform testing, because it's a complex world we live in. We do user interface related testing, API testing. Obviously, there's databases involved in this. There's potentially mainframes involved in this. There's client server systems. Accessibility was a big topic at my last company, and we actually implemented an accessibility team, and we're at the point of being evaluated after having gone through a full cycle of accessibility testing. Performance testing, teams doing a lot of performance testing. I would say that pretty much covers it. There's various types of performance testing.
Security.
So we don't actually perform the security testing. Actually, at my last company, we were building the capability to take that away from the information, InfoSec team to have they had a system where part of it was done by InfoSec, part of it was done by an outside contracting company doing penetration testing. We wanted to take that in-house and do that ourselves. So we were building the capability in the last year that I was there. We don't perform that function now, but we have some people who are very capable in that area and have been part of that. So we could build that out as a capability on our side, but right now there's a crack team that does that in our InfoSec world.
Okay, cool. That makes sense. And okay, so with all this type of testing, I'm assuming you have a range of teams in terms of like maturity levels. I guess how often is the best one delivering to production, and how often is the worst performer delivering to production?
I couldn't even tell you that.
No?
So it's a large team. It's a very large team. There's a couple of hundred people in this group. So
Okay.
I would say that in general, we do 2-week sprints and we deliver as frequently as needed, right? So sometimes that could be monthly, it could be quarterly, it could be several times a week, depending upon what we're doing. So I think it varies with whatever is going on and whatever you would see in the market. And that's true. At my last company, we had gone from releases that were 8-month releases, and they were overlapping 8-month releases. So you're working on 1, 2, and 3 at the same time, and they'd be in various stages of design, development, and testing. And that happens when you have 1-month test cycles, right? But that eventually got to be 2-week sprints, and we were delivering monthly, religiously delivering monthly. And some of the teams, like our gateway teams over there and a few other teams, were delivering every 2 weeks, going in every 2 weeks, regular clockwork. So I think if you get really good at breaking down the work, and if you're getting a really well-groomed backlog from your product team, which I think was a challenge in those companies because they were building out a product team. So some groups could do it really well, some were just getting into it. Having a good groomed backlog so that your development team isn't asked to estimate something that is nebulous or doesn't have to elicit the requirements, estimate and build all in the same sprint, that's brutal, right? So that was another evolution at our last company, which was how do you get from delivering monthly? Like they would define a monthly release and they were delivering every month, and they would define 30 to 40, stories. Regularly at the end, it would be 50 to 60 stories because there was no controls on what was getting thrown into that release post the program increment. It was absolutely brutal. Getting control of that and saying, hey, we can move faster through this pipeline if we're consistent about the work that we're doing. Sometimes you have to slow down to move fast. And people laugh at that statement, but you have to slow down to move fast. Just like in the movie Cars, sometimes you have to turn the wheel right in order to turn left. You want to create the drift, you have to do that. Well, in order to slow that pipeline down, you get really consistent about delivering, and there's not as much rework, and you could really be very consistent and predictable about what you're going to be able to deliver. And it requires not just slowing the work down, but really understanding how to estimate and break it down into digestible chunks. And I would say in the last 8 years, I've had some really great agile practitioners to work with who knew their field and could really guide and coach people through that.
Can you share some lessons with us on that? Because I've always found it a challenge in terms of estimating and, as you mentioned, getting that consistent, predictable behavior for software delivery.
So you have to have buy-in at the executive level, right? That this is how we're going to operate. So your product teams and your the three-legged stool of product and business and development have to be aligned. That look, if you're going to put something in after we've defined what's in this release, then you have to take something out, right? Because we're literally stopping work on something to pick something else up. Added capacity just hanging around here, right? You do try to keep a little bit of capacity for those spikes that happen due to production incident or whatever, but I can't just increase capacity here for this release. Everybody's typically fully engaged already. So that's one lesson learned is if you get executive leadership involved and say, look, we want to go do that, but tell us what you will be happy are okay with delaying. Okay. One big lesson learned. I would say the teams got really good at doing planning poker, really a good blind estimate and coming to a kind of titrating that to get to a good number each time and understanding what it takes. As the team understands one another on the team and what they're able to do, they understand people's tendencies. Bob is always taking on more than he can chew, and we can cover for him. We know how to cover for him. Or Sue is sandbagging it. We know she's going to kill that, and she's going to take something else on. So we that's our added capacity. We use that. Like, there's different things that you learn when working with folks, and I think as the team matures, you get to some optimal point. And the first thing that somebody wants to do is, oh wow, we could take this person, put them on this team, and make that team better. Yeah, no, you won't. You'll screw both teams up doing that. Right? Now, you have to have a plan for how you provide professional development for these folks so that they grow beyond the team that they're on. But just thinking you're going to take one person from over here and throw them over here and solve the problem, you have to be ready for a decrease in productivity on both teams in order to get to that higher level of achievement later. It's not just, we're not plug and play, right?
Yeah. I'm trying to think about in terms of my career when I've worked on teams and that kind of shuffle has happened. What was the outcome?
Sometimes we're the person that has to leave.
Yeah.
I think what we don't do with teams is have a good succession strategy. There's always a leadership succession strategy, but what is that team succession strategy? It's somebody just gave their notice. Oh, let's just get another person. It's always just get another person. And sometimes it's time to rethink. Do you blow the team up and do something different? Every time someone comes into or leaves your organization, it's a great time to rethink. Do I have the right structure going forward? And divorce yourself from the existing plan and say, do we have the right stuff going forward? What do I see coming around the corner at me that I need to be aware of? And is now the time for me to start preparing for that?
That's a beautiful point, John. I never thought about it that way. And so, how are we determining if it's the right time to blow up a team and change things up? Is it if we're not moving in the direction that we want to move in, as you said, kind of anticipating what's around the corner? And if we feel that we need to blow up a team and have them do something else, that's
I
the
can
right
tell you,
course
I've
of
done it
action?
from a leadership team. I referred to it in my last company as rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. I had 5 major platforms that we were supporting. And I said, you're now working, you now have that team, you have that team, you have that team. So I changed the leadership around. And we even went down a level in some teams and changed some folks around. And it brings a new perspective into the team. Why are you doing it that way? Right? Like, I don't have the same baggage you do from the last 5 years. That's not how we did it over there, and we had this kind of success. But somebody goes over there and says, well, you were doing it this way if you just did this. So bringing in a different viewpoint. So imagine if your team is doing really well and they've plateaued, and is that the time to bring somebody in? I mean, that might be the time to bring somebody in to see, can we get to that next level? Can we bring in some different ideas? So you're trying to get to number one, and then all of a sudden you're at number one, and somebody says, well, there's a number above one. How do we get there? Right? Like, how do we get even higher? And maybe it means different thinking.
So, a lot of times I found that people or teams can be a little resistant to change,
No.
which
Oh
yeah,
no.
no, never,
Oh.
right? Yeah, that's so rare, right? when you're when you are shuffling these teams and rearranging the chairs on the Titanic, how are you communicating to these teams so that they're not frustrated with the changes that are happening?
I can control what I can control, and I can't control what I can't control. So for my team, I talked to them about my colleagues at a former company who had been there for 15 years, 20 years. And when they went into the marketplace because they were laid off, the only thing they knew was how to work in that company. They had no other experiences. They didn't have a variety of experiences. They worked on one platform and they were not marketable. And what I talk to my team about is, if all you've ever done is this, guess what? There's a whole world out there of experiences that you're lacking. The value of having worked in my screen over here, telecom and weather radars and retail and missile systems and mortgages and fault tolerant systems and tissue research. And like, the value of doing that is the experiences. And if your experiences are this one thing, you're not growing, and you will have problems later. So it's all about professional growth at that point. That's now the selling of change also has to include the stakeholders. Well, why would you make this change right now? Well, there has to be a good reason. There has to be well, we're trying to achieve this, right? And we can't get there doing what we're doing because we haven't been getting there doing what we're doing. And if we continue to do what we're doing, we're going to get what we got. So you have a two-prong approach there of how you go about it.
I love that. That's amazing points, John. I love the idea of selling it to the individual contributors, selling it from a career growth perspective, because I totally agree with you. And I think that makes sense. And I love that you mentioned the stakeholders as well, so that they understand why the change is happening.
So I want to kind of bring this point back to the beginning when we talked about all the different places I've worked at. So I haven't worked at places for 6 months and left, right? So when I look at a resume, if somebody's a job hopper, I'm not interested in that. Look, 3 years is great. I look at my career in 3-year increments. Whenever I go someplace, I said, can I be there for 3 years? Is that a place I want to be? And there have been, I think, 4 companies that I've been at in my career longer than 6 years. Every other one was a 1-year contract or a 1-year role, 1.5-year role. And it was kind of a try before you buy situation. Do I really want to be there? So the job hopper is not the person you're looking for. Um, there's nothing wrong with taking advantage of the market, or, hey, I made a mistake. I went to the wrong place. I've done that. It's not even on my resume. It was a 3-week mistake and I knew it on day one. Okay. So I think when you're looking at a person's career, it's what did they learn in that space and how long? Like when I look at a resume and they give me a page and they were there for 6 months, I'm like, it took you 3 months to come up to speed. What do you mean you did all of that? Right? Kind of overselling there a bit, I think. So let's get a little bit realistic. Getting somewhere for 3 years and saying, hey, is this the place I want to be? What's my next step? Knowing what that next step is important. So when I'm working with my teams, I'm telling them, look, I'm expecting you to leave the QA field. I'm expecting you to become a business analyst, a product owner, a developer, a project manager, a scrum master, or stay in QA. There's a world open to you, but look at it in 3-year increments. Give us 18 months to 24 months in your current role, and I will help you find the next one. No qualms about it. Let's map out a path for you based upon what you find challenging and valuable in your career. So I just wanted to make sure I pulled that back in a little bit.
I love that. Yeah, thanks, John. That was marvelous. You've shared so much marvelous, amazing information with us today. Like I've taken so many notes, and I think there's going to be so many clips created from this. Are there any pieces of advice that you want to leave us with that we didn't talk about that you feel are important for the community to know?
Yeah, that's the other reason why I opened that deck on the other side here is because there's a number of there's a few things here. There's 2 things as an industry I feel we do poorly. We're bad at requirements and we're bad at estimating. Wow, that's a hard beginning, right? And you can't blame product for bad requirements. They're trying to figure out where the market's going, and they're trying to define something that people will adopt, right? They're not being told. Ford doesn't come to you and say, what kind of car do you want? They build a car and you shall come to it. So
Or
getting
not?
good requirements is a challenge, and estimating against those requirements is always a challenge. So don't be surprised by that. Don't let that be the thing that frustrates you. In a job that requires frustration management, don't let that be the thing that frustrates you. I have a statement here that says most agile is failing because it's actually implemented as mini waterfalls. So don't be surprised if you feel like, wow, this doesn't really, like, I'm reading all this agile stuff and I'm taking this certification and we don't do that. Like, that's pretty normal that you're still trying to move the needle to becoming more agile. Are you implementing agile practices that are adding value is what you should be thinking about. As long as you're implementing those practices and doing that feedback loop from your product team, and at the end of each sprint, and getting better. I think that's more important than am I an agile purist. I took a note here that said there's never enough automation. No matter
mm,
whether you think
mm,
we have enough, there's never enough.
mm, mm,
Random thoughts. People leave most places because of their boss.
mm.
So I was a terrible manager when I started out 1988, 89 timeframe when I was leading people. I know that. And I know that the people who I was managing know that. And I'm in contact with several of them 30 years later. And I almost have to start every conversation with an
I'm
apology.
so sorry.
My first boss, Charlie, says to me, he said, "You'd have made a great first lieutenant in the Vietnam War. And quite unfortunately, you'd have been fragged by your own troops." Some people won't or don't want to learn to lead. Others won't or don't know how to follow. So I always found that it was my job to figure out how to follow my boss and give him what he needed. It's not his job to figure out how to do it 8 different ways or 10 different ways for the people who report to him. It's my job to take more things off of his plate and learn how to work with him. Dave Tompkins will love this one. If it was easy, I'd get a high school kid to do it. What we do is not easy. It involves people. It involves interacting with other folks, and we're not always on the same page, so it's not easy. The technology stuff is not the hard part of doing our job. It's the people, right? I do keep 2 quotes on my board. One is, "We can do more as a QA organization." I believe we blur the role between just having to do this or just having to do that. We can do more. The best person available to do the work on an agile team should do the work. So it's okay to blur the role. And that means finding more ways to say yes. Like if somebody comes to you with a problem, they're trying to solve something, they need your help. The answer isn't no. The answer is, all right, let's talk about what I can do, what I need help doing, and what I think we can't do. So find more ways to say yes. It doesn't mean capitulate on everything, but it means figure out how to help somebody solve a problem, because that's what we are as a service organization. And then my favorite one that I learned probably 25 years ago, 30 years ago, and 2 letter words. If it is to be, it is up to me. It's not somebody else's thing. It's take it, own it. So those are my
Wow.
suggestions.
Amazing. I love all of that, especially the last one of you. You kind of touched on it in 2 points. I don't know if you ever read the book Extreme Ownership by Jacko Willink.
Jacko,
Um,
got it. I've got it right here on the shelf. I think I've got my copy right there. Yeah.
there you go. Beautiful. Yeah, that to me was like one of the most impactful books that I've ever read, because it ultimately just says, I mean, as the title implies, but to give a high level overview, that basically we're responsible for everything happening in our lives. And when we take extreme ownership and realize that if it is to be, it is up to me, we become empowered to change our lives and careers and whatever into whatever we want. It's when we stop taking ownership and start putting blame on other circumstances that we start to lose power and our life becomes more difficult.
I agree. I remember the manager who gave me that book about 6 years ago and 5 years ago, and absolutely agree with you 100%.
John, you seem like from the conversation that I've had with you, the lessons that I learned, you seem like an amazing leader. Do you have any resources that you can tell us to look at to become a better leader manager?
So that's a real interesting question. I look at all of these books that we read, and the success stories um, are born out of failure, and so you learn more from your failures or from other people's failures than you do from your successes. So I think reading about other people's successes, how they've achieved success, and trying to put that into your context. So I had a boss who said, "Geez, I really hate following Dan. Whenever I have to speak after Dan, it's really brutal because he's an amazing communicator and it's a tough act to follow," right? It doesn't mean he doesn't do it. He will do it, right? So he has to figure out how to do it his way. And when he was coaching me, he says, "I don't expect you to do what I do the way I do it. I expect you to take from this conversation the principle of what you're trying to accomplish and do it in your way, how you will do it." And I get really concerned when I have managers who are trying to do what I do. WWJD, what would John do? That's fine. Just don't do it the way I would do it. Do it the way you will do it. Do it authentically the way you would do it. So I think if you read enough of these books, you will learn those ways of achieving success and do what's right for you and for your personality, and that will adapt over time as you have experiences to build upon.
I love it.
So no one book.
Okay.
I would say read many.
Many.
Leaders
Any
are readers.
recommendations to start? Like
Was it
a
Extreme
couple?
Ownership
Yeah.
was a really good one.
All right.
Um, and
I see. Is that the Phoenix Project over there?
The Phoenix Project is there as
That's
well.
a good read. Yeah.
Absolutely. I would say there's some really How to Win Friends and Influence People is a very interesting, very old book worth reading. I would also suggest that I get a lot out of biographies, and I would say that Teddy Roosevelt was an incredible read. Guy was an amazing guy. So I think you can get a lot from leaders like from the past, like Jack Welch, books about dealing with people from everything from media and sports people to political leaders, as well as our technology leaders, is take a wide swath of people who interest you. And by the way, if it doesn't resonate with you, put it down. Read it 5 or 10 years from now. If it doesn't resonate with you, don't force yourself into it, but make sure you're doing a variety.
Beautiful. John, thank you so much for joining the Ultimate QA podcast. I've
You're
learned
welcome.
so much, and I'm sure that our audience has as well. Thank you so much for your time.
Appreciate the opportunity to share, and happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Bye bye.
Bye bye.